record now, is I'm going to teach you how to start preparing for the assessment. So yesterday we talked about the fact that there are unit standards and we've got free assessment methods and that there's an assessment process that we've got to follow. So now we're going to start putting that into practice. So over there you'll see it says sample unit standard 9303. This matrix document is open is that one. So I've already got the unit standard open here. I'm just going to zoom into it. So one thing to realize is that each unit standard has got a unique ID number. That ID number isn't shared with any other unit standard in the system. So that's why we often refer to unit standards by their number, because often there are ones that have similar names, but the number is always unique. So now when we're planning our assessment, we would use this matrix tool to make sure we know exactly what's going on in the unit standard and how to assess it properly. So you can, for the purposes of our class, assess a learner on any topic. But I've chosen this 9303 because it's something that's easy enough to assess. It doesn't have a great deal of difficulty or anything like that. So it's and I've also got all of the documents written for that. So if you want to use something else, then you can just discuss it with me. But this 9303 is the one that you can use most easily. Okay. So now when we're filling in this matrix, I just want to show you how it looks when it's completed. I know it looks now very terribly complicated, but we're going to approach it step by step, and then you'll see it's not that complicated. Okay, so first thing we do is we put in the number. So 9303, 9303. And then we put in the title. Now the entire title is very long, so we're not going to be able to fit it in completely. So we're just going to say, communicate verbally with clients. Then we're going to look for what is the NQF level. Oh, it's NQF level 3. And what's the amount of credits? Also 3. Okay, so one thing that we spoke about yesterday is the levels indicate the complexity. The matric certificate is NQF level 4. So that means we can say that this is actually a simple course. It's not a difficult course. And we also see that it's 3 credits. Now a certificate is a minimum of 120 credits. So if this one is 3 credits, we know it is a very small course. A 3-level course is usually something that would get done in a day. So it's a kind of a day-long course. Then we'll also see it's got a registration start date and a registration end date. So training providers could only accredit for this starting in 2018 up until 2023. After that, they won't be able to reaccredit for it. And then you'll see there's a last date for enrollment. So students would still be able to enroll at your institution up until that date. And then you will have 3 years to finish any active enrollments. Now, that's because in the system, you've got a degree, and a degree is then supposed to be 3 years long. So after that, you can still enroll people for 1 year, and then they still have 3 years to replace it. However, this unit standard wasn't written in 2018. It was written originally, we can see from the number, this is a small number, so this is a very old unit standard. Newer unit standards have larger numbers. So this one was written probably somewhere 2004, but that date is saying 2018 because they've been renewing it. So usually what happens, if it hasn't been replaced by another qualification, it just gets renewed. So in 2023, this date is going to move up there, and all of the other dates are just going to move up. So a unit standard then technically has a lifespan of 5 years. So from there to there, 5 years, and then 6 years, and then another 3 years. So a unit standard has a lifetime of 10 years. Okay, so unit standards then would always have a purpose. And that purpose is then why it exists. So this particular 9303 unit standard is intended for people who attend to client queries either face-to-face or telephonically. It reinforces the listening, speaking, and recording skills necessary to communicate with clients in a financial services environment. And then it lists 4 things that the qualifying learner will be able to do. Listen for information in a verbal communication, using plain language in a verbal communication, capturing information from a verbal communication, and providing information in response to a verbal communication. So those are the 4 things that this one is going to do. Okay, so now here we see that learning is assumed to be in place. You'll remember yesterday I spoke about how matric isn't a prerequisite for doing these types of courses. These courses are meant to be open and accessible to everyone. So there is open access to this unit standard. Learners should be competent in communication and mathematical literacy at level 10. So that's NQF level 2, so that is related to grade 10. So level 2 equals grade 10, level 1 equals grade 9. Okay, and there they just list what barriers to effective communication could be, include pronunciation, enunciation, dialect, slang, and jargon. So now we see that the unit standard has got specific outcome number 1. And specific outcome number 1 has got 5 assessment criteria. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put there specific outcome number 1, and then we're going to put 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because we've got 5 assessment criteria. Then so the first thing we do is we build the shell of the unit standard on our template. So now we see we've got specific outcome number 2. And specific outcome number 2 has got 4 assessment criteria. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we see we've got a specific outcome number 3, and it has 5 assessment criteria. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we see we've got a 4th specific outcome, and this one has got 1, 2 assessment criteria. Now, yesterday I also told you that a unit standard has then critical cross-field outcomes and essential embedded knowledge. Now, this particular one doesn't have any essential embedded knowledge. So we're just going to turn that into, so that we can see that there's nothing there. So that one's not applicable. Okay, and then we've got CCFO number 1, which is identifying. Then we've got one that says collecting. Then we've got one that says communicating. Then we've got one that says demonstrating. So then we've got 4 of them. Okay, so now we've got the structure of our unit standard. But for now, we're first going to focus on this column. This is usually some work that a designer does before the time, but you as an assessor, as part of your own preparation, you must always then just check to see whether the designer has done a proper job. We don't assess the learner on the specific outcome. We assess them on the assessment criteria. Now, the assessment criteria is always written to have a verb in it. So this first sentence goes, the emotional state of the caller client is gauged from tone, pitch, pace, and volume of voice. Now I want you to think back to those principles. The principles of assessment, the first one said we had to carry out a valid assessment. And that means the assessment must be realistic. So how many people are going to be involved in this assessment? We're going to have 3 people involved in the assessment. You as the assessor, then there's going to be a learner, and then there's going to be a customer. So who is gauging the tone, pitch, pace, and volume of the voice? Your learner. So how are you as the assessor going to determine if they can do it? I would say that you can do it via observation. You would look at your learner interacting with the client to see whether they can do it. So remember, observation also includes your ears. It's not just your eyes. It's also your ears and all of your other senses. Now, the second criteria, body language is observed to support the interpretation of the client's vocal indicators in face-to-face interactions. So what's the key word there? Observed. So your client or your learner has to observe the client, but you are also going to be observing your learner as they're observing the client. Now, the next criteria, criteria number 3, own tone, pitch, pace, and volume are adjusted to emphasize with the client's emotional state. This means your learner is going to have to adjust how they're speaking. You're not going to like, oh, I'm sorry to hear you've been in a car accident. That must have been terrible. That's not an appropriate tone of voice, because it makes me sound like I'm happy that the person has been in an accident. So what's the easiest way for you then as an assessor to determine that? It would once again be observation. Now this next one, the main idea is extracted from the client's verbal communication, and an assessment is made of the client's needs. They've got to extract the main idea. So that means your learner has to listen to the client and find out what the client wants. Again, the easiest way for you to assess that would be via observation. Then our next criteria that we have, criteria number 5 there, is questions are asked to elicit the supporting details and clarify understanding of the need. Now, you might go, questions, except who is asking the question? Your learner is asking the question of the client. Okay, ma'am, so you want to take out a bank loan to buy a new car because your previous car was damaged in an accident. That would then be a question that your learner is asking of the client, which would make it an observation. Now, our next specific outcome is use clear, plain language in a verbal communication. So that means your client now has to speak clearly and use plain language. This first criteria, technical language is used appropriately and explained in own words where necessary. So when the person is talking about debits and credits and stuff like that. In terms of intellectual property, it's always very frustrating when people who don't know a lot about it are talking about it, because they confuse things with like trademark and copyright and patents, and all 3 of those are very, very distinct things. But in this case, so technical language is being used correctly, so that would again be observation. Now, this next one is a bit trickier. Verbal mannerisms, jargon, and slang are identified in terms and assessed in terms of their contribution to a business interaction. What's our key word there? Identify. Now, how does somebody identify something? If I ask you, what is this? Then you'll say, this is a 400 milliliter bottle of Coca-Cola. And then you'd be correct. So what method did I just use? I just made use of the method of questioning, because you can't really easily observe someone identifying something, especially when it's something like jargon and slang. So jargon is when people are using technical language, terms like copyright, patent, trademark. Those are all examples of jargon. Slang is more unofficial language, informal language. Like when you're calling a taxi a Zola Bud, or when you're, calling a piece of money a tiger, which is apparently a 10 Rand, which I don't get, because on a 10 Rand, it's a rhino, not a leopard even. So I would think that a tiger would be a 200 Rand note. Okay, so that would then be questioning. Then our next one, the variation in tone, pitch, pace are used to enhance meaning and to respond appropriately. Again, that's something that you would observe. Our next one is criteria 4. Barriers to effective communication in the business environment are identified in order to facilitate communication with clients. So that one is again going to be questioning, because the key word there is identified. So how are we then, now we should maybe take a moment and look at these ones. So an on the job is when we would be assessing the person at the bank, really helping a client. But that would be very difficult to manage, very difficult to arrange. So, and the simulation would be when we make our office look like a bank space. But the role play is where we pretend it is a bank. So I would go with, we'd have a role play for all of the observations. And then those 2 questions we would have as an oral interview. So then our next one, number 3.1, appropriate information is clarified in plain language. That's observation once again. The client's interpretation of information is checked using open-ended questions. Again, this isn't you asking questions. This is the learner asking questions of the client. So that is observation. Then criteria number 3, a range of relevant options is described and explained to the client in order to agree on a plan of action. That's again an observation. Consensus is reached on the most viable option to resolve the query. That is going to be observation again. And then number 3.5, the proper procedure to be followed is outlined clearly, including action steps, responsibilities, and deadlines. Okay. Now the next one, specific outcome 4, capture information from a verbal communication. Then the next one that we have there is assessment criteria 4.1. The main idea and supporting details of a communication are recorded in rough notes to facilitate recall. So recorded, that means it must be written down. And when you're looking at something that somebody has made, it is a product evaluation or a product sample. So if, for example, you might think, why isn't it observation? I'm now busy writing something on my hand. You see, I've got a pen and I'm busy writing. You're observing me writing. But what did I write down? You don't know because you couldn't see it. Actually, I'm just going to write it on a piece of paper. Okay, well, the sensor is blocking out the piece of paper, but if you would have seen it, it would have said hello. So that would have been a product evaluation. Then the next one here is accurate file notes are recorded on the system or manually as required to form a comprehensive record of the interaction. So that we would put down again as a product evaluation. So then all of these activities over here is going to be role play. What type of an assessment is it going to be? It's a type of assessment that you're doing to give credits. So it's going to be a summative. What type of evidence is it going to be? It's going to be direct evidence. These 2 with the questioning are going to be foundational. And then the rest of them are going to be practical. And then the places where the person has to give advice would be places where it is reflexive. So 3.2 and 3.4 and 3.5. Those would then be reflexive, because then the person has to be making decisions and then giving advice. Okay. And then we're running a bit out of time with this lecture, because we only have about a minute left before it kicks us all off. You would take these CCFOs and place them where they fit the best. As an example of this, here you can see that I've said that CCFO number 6, demonstrating, fits with assessment criteria number 1, and EEC number 1 fits with assessment criteria number 1.1. Okay, so what's going to happen in 30 seconds, it's going to kick us all off because it's going to stop the meeting. So what I'm then just going to do right now is I'm just going to send all of you an invitation again. So let's take a 5-minute break quickly so that we can, get a glass of water and stuff like that. And then in 5 minutes from now, I'm going to send another invite, and then we can have another 30 or so minute session. Yeah, Derry just told me running out of time. I need to pay them money to upgrade. So see you in 5 minutes, everyone. Actually, I'm curious to see how it looks when the meeting ends. So let's just hold on for about a couple more seconds. Where is it showing? Oh, wait. It looks like it's given us 9 more minutes. Okay, that's great. So I'm just going to share the screen again. Yeah, it's now got a handy little timer. It's counting down 9 minutes, but that should be enough a bit. Okay, so now I'd like to, when you see that I'm unmuting you, that's going to be your chance to ask some questions. So let's then just start with Mpo. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so well, this exercise then, do you see why I say that we need to, before you do an assessment, this is your first step?
Yes, I do. Because then you get to understand what are the outcomes that you need in order for the assessment to be successful, if that's the correct word.
Yeah. And your question from yesterday about the RPL. So
yes.
What you would then also, what I would suggest if you're running an RPL project is then you teach the people about the assessment methods and the assessment principles, and then you teach them how to unpack a unit standard like this so that they can know what evidence they must be giving you. And then also,
okay.
One thing to keep in mind, a unit standard like this one that is very practical, it'll actually be quicker for you to assess somebody on this by having them do the role play rather than looking at RPL evidence. So for example, if I was RPLing somebody for this certificate in, this is part of the National Certificate Financial Services, then I wouldn't RPL them on just a single unit, or I wouldn't RPL them on this. I would say, okay, here's a customer who wants to open a bank loan, and you've got to help them through the process. Then that assessment only takes like 5 minutes, and then you can sign the person off as being competent. Because that's what an assessment is always about. You just have to get some evidence together that the person can do something.
Okay.
Okay.
So can I just ask 2 quick questions? So I was told that You'd also have to go to the learner's workplace when you're doing an RPL. Is it for the practical side of things instead of just doing role play?
Yeah.
Because I mean, yeah, I think it would be easier if we had to go to the workplace in
Yes.
order to assess the
Yeah.
practical side of it.
Yeah. So you see, it all depends on how the assessment is designed.
Mm,
And so the thing is, as an assessor, people think of this system as being a much more rigid system than it is really, because you can approach the assessment in a lot of different ways. What is just very important is that as an assessor and a moderator and a training provider, you can justify why you're doing something in a certain way. So this unit standard 9303, if the people are involved in a learnership, then you can, where they're working in a bank, then the evidence for this can be collected by their supervisor in a day-to-day work. Or you as the assessor can go in and watch them do it and then assess them. But if they're not on a learnership, if they're doing a short course, then it would be more difficult, less manageable, in other words, to do it on the job. And then it would be more manageable to do it as a role play. So as long as you can justify this is why we've done it according to this principle and that we've met all of these outcomes, then one is actually covered.
Okay. And then I just also realized, Dirk, that you don't really need a matric to get a qualification.
Not
I
at all.
think the only barrier, I think the only barrier in South Africa in terms of you having to get a matric is that private sector, when you're applying for a job at private sector, they'll say one of the requirements would be matric. As with government, they would say an NQF4 equivalent qualification.
Yes.
So is that now basically the only reason why you have to get a matric? Is it because of you trying to get a job in private sector?
Yeah. So take, for example, this qualification, this National Certificate Financial Services. It's on NQF level 3. And if we take a look here at the learning assumed to be in place, it says it allows open access. And this can be done through RPL, either partially or completely. So in here, it says nothing about matric. So for example, all NQF level 4 and below qualifications, it doesn't make sense to require matric because this work is simpler than matric. So you can't say like, you must have a higher qualification before you can study a lower qualification. So, and yeah, it's pretty much the same with all of these NQF qualifications. And there's like 15 to 20,000 of them. None of them would say must have a matric. So it's usually training providers that say that people must have matric. And that's because they don't want to teach these fundamentals. They just want to be able to, as you can see, here's quite a few fundamentals in this qualification. Training providers don't want to train people on these. So then they just say, oh, you must have matric, because then they can sign off that you can do a lot of these fundamentals. But the qualification itself doesn't require it. So it's usually training providers who say it because they want to make their own job easier. The universities, however, are restricted by legislation. The kind of that people must have certain scores is reflected in national legislation, but that doesn't limit us as private training providers.
So the reason why universities would need a matric is because they don't fall under CETA, they are CHE, am I correct?
Yeah.
So the legislature for CHE and the CETA would be different.
Yes. All education in South Africa falls under the NQF Act in terms of legislation. But the universities have an additional piece of legislation called the Higher Education Act. The CETAs then have the Skills Development Act, and Umalusi then has the Schools Act. So the different acts add in additional things.
Oh, okay. Just one more question that I typed on the chat. would private sector be given rebates for short skills program? Because I know with SARS, they've got what they call the learnership rebate. I've never seen anything regarding short skills programs.
Okay, so when we come back, because your question is going to be longer than the 1 minute 15 seconds we've got left, when we come back, I'm going to have a discussion with all of you about the WSPs and ATRs and the skills development levy. So when we come back in 5 minutes, we're going to have a discussion about that, and that's going to answer that question of yours.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to end the meeting now. So, and then I'm going to, in 5 minutes from now, just send out an invite to everybody. And then I'm going to just give everybody a couple of minutes to sign in. And then we're going to start by talking about the Skills Development Levy and the Skills Development Levy Act. Okay, see you all in a couple of minutes. I just need to figure out how to stop the meeting now. There we go. See you all in